While Napoleon celebrated victory near the pyramids, another battle was quietly approaching, one that would decide the fate of the entire expedition. The French army now controlled Cairo, but control on land meant nothing without control of the sea. The Mediterranean was dominated by the British Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force in the world, and its commanders were already searching for the missing French fleet. At the center of that search stood one of Britain's most daring officers, Horatio Nelson. Nelson had been tracking the French for months. Storms, miscalculations, and sheer bad luck had delayed him, but he refused to give up. Finally, in early August 1798, British scouts located the French fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. The French believed they were safe. Their ships were anchored in a defensive line close to the shore. They assumed the shallow waters would prevent British ships from passing between them and land. It was a fatal miscalculation. On August 1, 1798, as the sun began to set, Nelson attacked. Instead of confronting the French line from one side, British ships performed a bold and unexpected maneuver. They sailed not only along the seaward side, but also between the French fleet and the shore. The French ships were suddenly trapped between two lines of enemy fire. Cannons thundered across the bay. Flames lit up the night sky. Smoke covered the water so thickly that sailors could barely see their own decks. The battle raged for hours. One by one, French ships were destroyed or captured. At the center of the French line stood their flagship, French battleship L'Orient. Late in the night, it caught fire. The flames spread rapidly through the ship's gunpowder stores. Then, a massive explosion. The blast shook the bay, sending debris raining down over both fleets. For a brief moment, the fighting stopped in stunned silence. But when the smoke cleared, the French position was hopeless. By morning, most of the French fleet had been destroyed. Only a few ships managed to escape. The consequences were catastrophic. Napoleon's army was now stranded in Egypt. There would be no easy reinforcements, no secure supply lines, no reliable communication with France. The Mediterranean belonged to Britain. The Battle of the Nile transformed what had seemed like a bold strategic maneuver into a dangerous isolation. Across Europe, the victory electrified Britain and encouraged new coalitions against France. The myth of French invincibility was shattered at sea. For the soldiers in Egypt, the reality was brutal. They were trapped in foreign territory, surrounded by potential enemies, dependent on limited resources. Napoleon faced a strategic nightmare. He had won brilliantly on land, but he had lost control of the sea. And in imperial warfare, naval dominance often determined everything. Yet Napoleon did not surrender to despair. Instead, he turned inward, attempting to consolidate control in Egypt and later pushing north toward Syria in hopes of expanding his influence. But the naval disaster at Abu Qir Bay had permanently changed the nature of the campaign. What began as an ambitious imperial project was now a struggle for survival. The French invasion of Egypt would never be the same again. By early 1799, Napoleon faced a dangerous reality. His fleet had been destroyed at the Battle of the Nile, his army was isolated in Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire was preparing a counterattack. The Ottomans were not alone. With support from Britain, whose navy now dominated the Mediterranean, a new front was forming to crush the French presence in the region. Napoleon understood the threat clearly. If the Ottoman army invaded Egypt from Syria, his position would collapse. So he made a bold decision. He would strike first. In February 1799, Napoleon led his army north into what is now modern-day Palestine and Syria. The march was brutal. The desert terrain returned. Supplies were thin. Disease began to spread among the troops. Water was scarce, and heat was relentless. Still, the French army moved forward. They captured several towns along the coast, including Gaza and Jaffa, but the capture of Jaffa came at a terrible cost. After the city fell, thousands of Ottoman prisoners were taken. Lacking food and unable to guard them, Napoleon made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He ordered their execution. The act would stain his reputation for years to come. and as if that were not enough, plague began spreading through the French ranks. Soldiers weakened, morale faltered, but Napoleon pressed on. His objective was clear: the fortified coastal city of Acre. Acre was not just another town. It was a heavily defended fortress overlooking the Mediterranean, a strategic gateway between Syria and Egypt, and its defense was commanded by a determined Ottoman governor. Supported by British naval forces under Sir Sidney Smith, the British Navy, once again, would play a decisive role. Ships offshore supplied Acre with reinforcements and artillery. Even worse for the French, they intercepted French siege equipment that had been sent by sea. Napoleon arrived at Acre in March 1799. He expected a quick victory. Instead, he faced months of frustration. The French launched repeated assaults on the city walls. Cannons fired relentlessly. Infantry advanced again and again. Breaches were opened, but each time, defenders repaired them. Ottoman resistance was fierce. British naval guns bombarded French positions from the sea. Disease spread further among French troops. Heat, hunger, and exhaustion took their toll. The once unstoppable army that had crushed the Mamluks now found itself trapped before stubborn stone walls. Napoleon personally supervised attacks. He tried to inspire his men. He pushed for decisive breakthroughs, but Acre did not fall. After 2 months of failed assaults, mounting casualties, and worsening conditions, Napoleon made the decision he rarely accepted: retreat. In May 1799, the French army withdrew back toward Egypt. The Syrian campaign had failed. Acre had held. Strategically, the consequences were enormous. Napoleon had hoped to weaken the Ottomans permanently and perhaps even open a path toward further eastern expansion. Instead, his army returned to Egypt exhausted, reduced, and plagued by illness. The aura of invincibility was cracking. The Siege of Acre marked a turning point. It proved that Napoleon could be stopped. It showed the power of British naval coordination with Ottoman ground forces, and it revealed the limits of French ambition in the Middle East. The campaign that began with triumphant victory at the pyramids was now strained, isolated, and increasingly unsustainable. The question was no longer whether Napoleon could expand. The question was how long he could hold on. By mid-1799, the French position in Egypt was fragile. The army was isolated. Supplies were limited. Disease had weakened thousands of soldiers. And now, the Egyptian people themselves began to rise. From the beginning, Napoleon had tried to present himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He claimed to respect Islam. He promised justice. He attempted to win over local elites and religious leaders, but occupation is occupation. Heavy taxes, forced requisitions, cultural misunderstandings, and the visible presence of foreign troops created deep resentment. In Cairo, anger turned into rebellion. The first major uprising had already erupted in October 1798, known as the Cairo Revolt. Religious leaders and local citizens mobilized against French rule. Streets filled with chaos. French patrols were attacked. Government buildings were targeted. Napoleon responded decisively and brutally. French artillery bombarded parts of Cairo, including areas near the historic Al-Azhar Mosque. The revolt was crushed, but trust was destroyed. The message was clear: French control would be enforced by force. Yet repression did not create stability. It created silence and waiting. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was preparing another attempt to reclaim Egypt. In July 1799, Ottoman forces landed again at Abu Qir. Napoleon moved quickly. In a sharp and aggressive engagement, the Battle of Abu Qir land battle, French forces defeated the Ottoman army before it could fully establish itself. It was a tactical success, but strategically, the situation remained dangerous. France itself was in turmoil. Back in Europe, the political leadership of the French Republic was unstable. New coalitions were forming against France. The broader war was intensifying. Napoleon understood something critical: his future was not in Egypt, it was in France. In August 1799, Napoleon made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He left, secretly, without informing most of his army. He boarded a small group of ships and sailed back to France, slipping past the British Royal Navy, which still dominated the Mediterranean. He left command in Egypt to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber. To many, this departure looked like abandonment. The army remained stranded. The campaign was unfinished. The long-term objective had failed, but Napoleon saw a greater opportunity. When he arrived in France in October 1799, he found a nation politically exhausted and unstable. Within weeks, he launched the coup of 18 Brumaire. The French Republic effectively ended. Napoleon became first consul, the ruler of France. The Egyptian campaign, despite its military struggles and strategic failures, had strengthened his image at home. His victories were emphasized, his setbacks were minimized. History was being rewritten, even as the remaining French forces in Egypt continued fighting for survival. The invasion of Egypt and Syria did not achieve its original goals. It failed to permanently undermine British power. It failed to secure long-term French control. It failed to expand into the wider Middle East, but it transformed Napoleon's career. Egypt was not his greatest military victory, it was his political stepping stone. And while the campaign would officially end in 1801, the consequences would echo far beyond the sands of the Nile. The Middle East had felt the shock of European imperial ambition, and Europe had witnessed the rise of a man who would soon crown himself emperor. By 1801, the French campaign in Egypt was over. After Napoleon's departure, French forces continued fighting under new leadership. But without naval support, without reinforcements, and surrounded by Ottoman and British pressure, their position was unsustainable. In 1801, British and Ottoman forces forced the remaining French troops to surrender. The invasion had failed militarily, yet history rarely measures impact only by victory or defeat. Because what Napoleon began in 1798 changed far more than battle lines. First, the campaign reshaped European understanding of the Middle East. Napoleon had not only brought soldiers, he brought scientists, engineers, scholars, and artists. They documented Egypt's monuments, geography, and culture in unprecedented detail. During the occupation, French troops discovered one of the most important archaeological artifacts in history, the Rosetta Stone. That discovery would later allow scholars to decode ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. A military invasion had triggered a revolution in Egyptology. Second, the invasion marked a turning point in imperial politics. The Ottoman Empire realized how vulnerable its provinces were to European intervention. Britain recognized Egypt's strategic importance, a gateway to India. From that moment forward, Egypt would never again be viewed as a distant province. It became a geopolitical prize. Decades later, British occupation of Egypt would confirm that shift. Napoleon had failed to hold Egypt, but he revealed its global importance. Third, the campaign accelerated Napoleon's rise. Despite the setbacks, despite the naval disaster at the Battle of the Nile, Napoleon returned to France not as a defeated general, but as a bold visionary. Within months, he seized power. Within a few years, he crowned himself emperor. The Egyptian expedition did not destroy him, it launched him. But for Egypt itself, the consequences were complex. The invasion exposed weaknesses in the Mamluk system. It disrupted long-standing political structures. It introduced new military and administrative ideas. Although French rule was brief, the shock of invasion opened a new era of transformation. Soon after, Muhammad Ali would rise and begin modernizing Egypt in ways that reshaped its future. In that sense, 1798 was not an ending, it was a beginning. The French invasion of Egypt and Syria was a campaign of ambition, brilliance, miscalculation, and consequence. It began with confidence at the pyramids. It nearly expanded through Syria. It collapsed under naval isolation, and it ended with a general sailing home to claim a throne. History is rarely simple, and sometimes, even failure can change the world. If you made it to the end of this documentary, Thank you for staying through the entire journey, from the landing at Alexandria, to the Battle of the Pyramids, to the naval disaster, to the Siege of Acre, and finally, Napoleon's secret departure. This was more than a story about one invasion. It was about how a single campaign reshaped Egypt, Europe, and the balance of global power. If you enjoyed this deep historical breakdown, like the video, though more history lovers can find it. Subscribe to the channel for more long-form historical documentaries. And comment below, what topic should we cover next? Should we dive into Muhammad Ali's rise, Napoleon's rise to emperor, or the next major turning point in Middle Eastern history? Your support builds this channel, and history never ends. I'll see you in the next episode. By the end of the 18th century, Europe was in turmoil. France had just emerged from the French Revolution, a period that destroyed the monarchy, reshaped society, and left the country surrounded by enemies. Almost every major European power feared illusionary France, and many were already at war with it. Among France's greatest rivals was the British Empire. Britain dominated global trade, its navy controlled the seas, and its wealth flowed from overseas colonies, especially India. France knew it could not defeat Britain easily in Europe. The British Navy was too powerful, and a direct invasion across the English Channel was nearly impossible. So French leaders began searching for an indirect strategy. Their answer was Egypt. At the time, Egypt was officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality it was ruled locally by the Mamluks. Strategically, Egypt sat at the crossroads between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Whoever controlled it could threaten Britain's trade routes to India, the heart of British wealth. For France, Egypt was not just a territory, it was leverage. At the center of this plan stood a young and ambitious general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had already become a national hero after his victories in Italy. He was brilliant, confident, and dangerously popular. Many politicians in France admired him and feared him. Sending Napoleon to Egypt served two purposes. First, it allowed France to strike at British interests without fighting Britain directly. Second, it removed Napoleon from French politics, at least temporarily. Napoleon himself embraced the plan enthusiastically. He believed Egypt could become the foundation of a French empire in the East. He imagined controlling trade routes, spreading French influence, and even surpassing the achievements of Alexander the Great. But Napoleon's vision went beyond military conquest. Unlike most invasions of the time, the Egyptian expedition included not only soldiers, but scientists, engineers, artists, and scholars. France wanted to present itself not merely as a conqueror, but as a bringer of knowledge and progress. This idea fit perfectly with the ideals of the Enlightenment: reason, science, and discovery. Napoleon believed that by respecting local customs, studying ancient civilizations, and modernizing administration, France could legitimize its rule in Egypt. It was an ambitious and deeply risky experiment. Still, the plan was built on dangerous assumptions. French leaders underestimated Britain's naval power, they underestimated Ottoman resistance, and they misunderstood the reactions of the local population. Egypt was not an empty prize waiting to be claimed. It was a deeply rooted society with its own political structures, religious authorities, and traditions, none of which welcomed foreign occupation. The invasion was not simply a military move. It was a collision between empires, ideologies, and civilizations. By the summer of 1798, preparations were complete. A massive French fleet assembled in secret. Thousands of soldiers boarded ships, unsure of their final destination. Napoleon stood at the height of his ambition. France was about to launch one of the most daring and controversial campaigns of the modern age. And with that decision, the French invasion of Egypt and Syria began. In July 1798, the horizon of the Mediterranean filled with sails. More than 300 ships carried the French expedition across the sea. Tens of thousands of soldiers, artillery, horses, and supplies. At their head stood Napoleon Bonaparte, confident that history was about to remember his name. On July 1st, the fleet reached the coast near Alexandria. The landing was not easy. The Mediterranean waves crashed against the shore, and the French soldiers struggled to disembark quickly. There was no proper harbor for such a massive force. Equipment was dragged through sand. Cannons were pulled by hand. Horses panicked in the surf, but speed was essential. Napoleon knew the element of surprise was his greatest advantage. Within hours, French troops advanced toward Alexandria. The city resisted briefly, but it fell quickly. The invasion had begun, yet Alexandria was only the first step. The true objective was Cairo, the political heart of Egypt, and the powerful Mamluk rulers who controlled it. The march from Alexandria to Cairo was brutal. The French army had trained in European landscapes, green fields, rivers, roads. Egypt offered none of these comforts. They marched across burning desert under a relentless sun. Water was scarce, food ran low. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. For many, the desert felt more dangerous than the enemy, but Napoleon pushed forward relentlessly. He understood that hesitation would give the Mamluks time to organize a full defense. Meanwhile, the Mamluks prepared for battle. They were elite warriors, famous for their skill on horseback, their curved swords, and their reputation for courage. For centuries, they had dominated Egypt's military elite. Their strategy was traditional and direct. Fast cavalry charges meant to break enemy lines. But Napoleon's army was different. It was modern, disciplined, structured. On July 21, 1798, near the village of Mbaba, just outside Cairo, within sight of the ancient pyramids, the two forces finally confronted each other. The battle that followed would become known as the Battle of the Pyramids. Before the fighting began, Napoleon addressed his troops. He famously declared, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Whether those exact words were spoken or later romanticized, the message was clear. This was more than a battle. It was history in the making. The Mamluk cavalry charged first. Thousands of horsemen advanced with speed and fury, swords raised, confident in their superiority. But Napoleon had prepared for exactly this moment. Instead of forming long, vulnerable lines, the French infantry formed massive defensive squares, hollow rectangles of soldiers, several ranks deep. Muskets pointed outward on every side. Artillery was positioned at the corners. When the Mamluk cavalry struck, they did not break the French lines. They collided with walls of disciplined gunfire. Volley after volley tore through the charging horsemen. Cannon fire shattered formations. The French squares held firm. The Mamluks fought bravely, but bravery alone could not overcome modern military organization and firepower. Within hours, the battle was decided. The Mamluk forces collapsed. Many fled toward Cairo. Others drowned attempting to escape across the Nile. French casualties were relatively light. Mamluk losses were devastating. The victory opened the road to Cairo. Soon after, Napoleon entered the city. To the outside world, the campaign appeared brilliant. France had defeated Egypt's ruling elite in a single decisive engagement. But beneath the triumph lay dangerous realities. The French army was deep inside foreign territory. Local resistance was beginning to grow. And most importantly, the British Navy was still at sea. The Battle of the Pyramids was a tactical masterpiece. Yet the campaign was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous phase was still ahead. In the summer of 1798, a French army appeared on the shores of Egypt. They did not come as traders. They did not come as explorers. They came with cannons, soldiers, scientists, and ambition. At their head was a young general who believed Egypt was the key to reshaping the world. This campaign would bring war to the Middle East, shake the Ottoman Empire, challenge British power, and introduce Europe to the ancient secrets of Egypt. It was an invasion that failed militarily, but succeeded in changing history forever. In this video, we'll tell the complete story of the French invasion of Egypt and Syria, how it began, what happened on the battlefield, how the people reacted, and why its consequences are still felt today.